Hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I'm David Lotney.
And I'm Bob Robinson. Christians are struggling with how to live like Jesus in a violent world. Influencers, politicians, and political pundits are telling us that we need to fight to take America back. When, in the midst of an ever increasing culture war, we hear that Jesus advocates for radical change, not through waging war, but by quote unquote waging peace, many of us just roll our eyes and think, oh, there's pie in the sky thinking.
Yeah, honestly, Bob, that's just a bunch of hippie nonsense, right?
And
So we can just ignore that. But so Easter week is the culmination of earthly ministry of Jesus. And our guest today is Jason Porterfield, and he wrote a book about Holy Week that will shake us out of our lethargy about hoping for peace. He is the author of a fantastic book titled Fight Like Jesus: How Jesus Waged Peace Throughout Holy Week, an award-winning book that equips readers with practical peacemaking skills as it examines how Jesus waged peace on each day of Holy Week.
Jason Porterfield's passion is to cultivate God's shalom peace wherever it is painfully absent and to help churches embrace their peacemaking vocation. Jason is with a ministry called Servants, an international network of Christian communities living and ministering among the urban poor. He was a founding member of the Servants team in Vancouver, started a new team in Indonesia, and was the director of operations for North America. Jason holds a Master of Theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. We are very glad to have Jason on the podcast today. This is an amazing book. You're going to really enjoy what he has to say.
So, welcome to the podcast, Jason. Thanks for writing this book and for being on the podcast with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's good finally, after 4 or 5 months since the initial invitation, to see both your faces, put a face to a name. So good to be with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I know sometimes it's like a long time in the making and then it feels good to actually meet. So um so I wanted to just kind of start off with, so you tell the story in the book about how you became discouraged when you embedded yourself in Canada's poorest neighborhood, trying to overcome the poverty and the injustice there. So can you talk a little bit about what that frustration was? And also, what I find interesting, and maybe you can speak on, how did Easter week give you hope with that frustration?
Sure. Yeah, let me back up a little bit further real
Yeah.
fast. So I was born into a military family, both parents in the military. That meant we lived in a lot of places growing up, eventually settled in Pennsylvania, where I went to a wonderful Baptist church that taught me to love Jesus, love the scriptures. I then went to a Christian college that was historically was started by the Brethren in Christ. That's one of the historic Peace Church traditions. Though by the time I went there, there were many different denominations represented at the school. 3 weeks into my freshman year, 9/11 happened, and that event profoundly shaped the next 4 years of my college experience. As with my classmates, I began to grapple for the very first time with questions of like, what does it mean to follow the Prince of Peace in a world that seemed to be ever increasingly consumed by war? And by the time I graduated from that college, to make a long story short, I felt that God was calling me to be a peacemaker, to be someone that seeks to cultivate God's shalom, especially in places where it's painfully absent. And so I joined a group called Servants, which is an international network of Christian communities that primarily live and minister in the slums of Asia. But they were started out of New Zealand, but they had growing interest from North Americans like myself. And so they thought, well, let's set up a sending office, but let's try to actually live out the very things we do in the slums of some of Asia's megacities in a Western context. So we're not just going to be a sending office, we're going to live this out as well. So I helped found that team, and the New Zealand family that had the initial vision for it came over from having lived in the slums of Cambodia, and they chose Vancouver's downtown east side. Vancouver, beautiful city, like gorgeous mountains right there on the ocean, sushi cheaper than McDonald's. I mean, it's like heaven on earth. But it's also home to the country's poorest urban neighborhood. It's a small place called the Downtown East Side, 4 by 8 city blocks. And so, in college, by the end of college, I could quote Jesus's peace teaching verbatim. I had grappled with that intellectually.
Hmm.
Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who persecute you, do good to those who hate you, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. Like I could quote Jesus's peace teaching verbatim, but I quickly realized in the Downtown East Side that I had no idea how to apply it, at least not within the messiness and complexity of that neighborhood. 5,000 residents struggling with pretty serious drug addictions, 1,200 experiencing homelessness, 900 women trapped in prostitution. But I knew those stats before I moved there. But what I didn't realize until I arrived was the very first month that I was there, the trial began in a nearby courthouse for Robert Pickton, who I soon learned was Canada's deadliest serial killer. He had, over the course of 10 years, butchered and fed to his pigs the bodies of 49 women, almost all from my neighborhood. And so my community was just understandably devastated and crushed and angry. Why had the police been so slow to listen to their cries for help? And so, one day I dragged myself to church with what felt like my last ounce of energy. I remember just walking there, not even taking the bus that day. And when I got there, it turned out to be Palm Sunday, the first day of Holy Week. And I'm guessing it's like your churches. This church turned the day into a joyous occasion. Most churches do, right? So the children paraded through the sanctuary, waving palm branches, shouting Hosanna. All the hymns were upbeat, major keys, no minor chords, right? And I was just in no mood to participate. And so when the pastor began his feel good message, I thought, I'm just going to read the gospel accounts of Palm Sunday. And so I randomly chose Luke's gospel. And that's when I noticed something I had just glossed over every time before. Luke tells us that as the crowd shouted cheers as Jesus made his not so triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, that Jesus was actually shedding tears. And when he could hold back his grief no more, he cries out, "If only you knew on this of all days the things that make for peace." The cry of my heart to learn from Jesus the things that make for peace. And then I felt like God said to me, if you want to learn how to apply Jesus' approach to peacemaking in your context, then you need to study the greatest peacemaker's greatest week, what we call Holy Week. If you take all four gospels and you smash together all their content, a third of that focuses on Jesus's last week, Holy Week. And yes, the week certainly contains teaching from Jesus, but it's also action packed. In other words, we get to see Jesus apply all of his previous peace teaching throughout that week. And that was the thing I so desperately longed for, to see how Jesus himself put into action his peace teaching. So the book Fight Like Jesus, it is a commentary on Holy Week, but it's also a training manual to help other Christians who want to become more faithful and effective practitioners of Jesus's approach to peacemaking.
It is good to meet you, Jason. My wife, Linda, was the one who actually found your book and recommended that I reach out to you for the podcast.
Mm.
She found it in Byron and Beth Borger's bookstore, Hearts and Minds bookstore, where we often
Yeah.
find the best books that we would never find anywhere else, that we did not know existed. So shout out Hearts and Minds books. In this book, you make that definitive case that the imperative key to understanding the interpretation of Holy Week is that first thing that Jesus says when he's weeping over Jerusalem. So why is that the key to understanding the mission of the Lord from Palm Sunday all the way to Easter Sunday?
That's a great question, and it's a fair question because most completely gloss over that lament, most books on Holy Week. I'll
Right.
give a few answers to that. Number one, we only read of Jesus weeping twice in the Gospels. The first, before raising Lazarus from the dead, he weeps with the women. And at that time, there's not a dry eye among them. And this is the second time. And so I think the passion with which Jesus spoke this lament, if only you knew the things that make for peace, reveals the depth of Jesus's concern for this issue, that this was on the forefront of Jesus's mind as he entered into his final days. Second, I would say that without this lament, it's easy to get all turned around in our thinking on some of the events of Holy Week. And so it's important for me to stress that Jesus spoke of things in the plural. He didn't say, if only you knew the thing. He said, if only you knew the things that make for peace. And I think, as an evangelical Christian, we often make much of the cross, and rightfully so. It's the main event. We're in a rush to get to Good Friday, right? Most of our churches, we celebrate Palm Sunday, and then we do nothing else until Good Friday. Maybe we have a Maundy Thursday evening service, right? The gospel writers do the opposite. They actually front load their coverage of Holy Week. Tuesday is the most talked about day of Holy Week, more than all the other days of Holy Week combined. Matthew's coverage of Tuesday is
Mm.
twice as long as his coverage of the Sermon on the Mount, for example. So, unlike us, the gospel writers, it seems like it was important for them for them to reveal to us the events that led up to his crucifixion. In other words, let me say it a different way. In saying, if only you knew the things that make for peace, Jesus indicated or hinted that we should not reduce his peacemaking efforts to one solitary act, the cross. And one of my concerns is that uh, as Christians, if we fail to realize that Jesus was crucified on Friday precisely because of how he contended for peace on the previous days of Holy Week, then we may fail to realize that we've accidentally embraced a very different approach to peacemaking, one that justifies killing enemies, one whose methods include nailing criminals to crosses. And so
Mm.
I think between the passion with which it was spoken, uh, and that indication that each day he's confronting injustice, calling out oppressors, and contending for shalom, that we begin to see that, when we think we're making much of the cross, we lift it up and we say, look at the cross, look at the cross. Sometimes we fail to realize that we've actually uprooted it from its context and we've severed it from the life of the one who gives it meaning, if that makes sense. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
so that's why I make that claim in the book, that it is the hermeneutical key through which to understand all that Jesus does, that with each day, Jesus is seeking to cultivate shalom and to correct our misguided assumptions about how peace is made.
Yeah, the cross is so important, right? It's
Yeah.
so central. And so we think, Jesus dying on the cross made peace for us by reconciling us to God, full stop. But there's more, right? You're saying there's that is important. Yes, that is, but that's not full stop. There's a context for this. What is he talking about? And you mentioned a word in what you're just saying. You're saying what makes for peace. So, and you said the word shalom. So you're talking not just peace as in, oh, a peace of mind or no more warring faction, but a different, more comprehensive peace. Can you define this peace or shalom for us?
Excellent question. Yeah, one of my initial working title for the book was Resurrecting Peace, and I thought it was clever. It had two meanings to it. But a literary agent said to me, "Well, you can't have that as the title because peace means 100 different things to 100 different people. Are you talking about inner peace? Are you
Exactly.
talking about peace
Yeah.
between members of a congregation, right? With war, violence, and so." Yeah, so in the very opening chapter, I try to define what I mean by peace, or more specifically, what the Bible means by this concept of shalom. And so shalom, it's more than just the absence of violence. Shalom is about healing, wholeness. It's about flourishing in all aspects, all relationships, uh, in our relationship with ourselves, with each other, with God, with creation. And so it's very comprehensive in scope, and such this sort of peace cannot coexist with injustice.
Right.
Holy Week begins with Palm Sunday. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, which is a strange image to imagine.
Mhm.
You in your book, you point out two aspects of this moment that I really had known before. First is that Pilate and his imperial army were approaching the city from the west to show the power of Rome and Caesar. And then Jesus and his followers were approaching from the east. So Pilate on a mighty war horse and Jesus is on a donkey. So here we see these two approaches to the city whose name actually mean peace,
Hmm.
which is very interesting to me. So what is the difference between the peace of Rome and the peace of Christ?
Yeah, this Pax Pax Romana. So let me back up and give a little history. We call that first day of Holy Week Palm Sunday, but for Jesus and time, this was the start of the week-long Passover festivities. So faithful Jews were coming from throughout the region to Jerusalem to commemorate. And Passover, as you'll recall, was to commemorate and honor and celebrate the time that God had liberated his people from an oppressive superpower. Back then it was Egypt. Well, for a people struggling under the yoke yet again of another oppressive superpower, it was that week was a painful reminder for them that they were no longer free and hoping that perhaps God would liberate them once again. And so it probably wouldn't surprise you to hear that the week actually had a track record of inciting all-out insurrection. It happened in 4 BC, for example. And after that event in 4 BC, Rome ordered that their provincial ruler in the area had to be in Jerusalem during the Passover festivities and had to bring with him substantial reinforcements. So you ask, what does the peace of Rome look like? Well, for them it was peace through strength, peace through might, right? So Pontius Pilate doesn't normally stay in Jerusalem. He leaves his home in Caesarea Maritima, marches, I always have to get my directions correct, marches east from the Mediterranean coast, entering through the western gate of Jerusalem, right? And like you said, would have been on a war horse. It was meant to be such a show of force that any thought of rebellion would be squashed. Like resistance is futile, right? And like you said, though, on this particular Passover, they hear that someone who had just raised someone from the dead was making his way from the opposite side of the city. So they rush out to meet him. So we read that the crowds do four things as Jesus makes his kind of counter procession into Jerusalem. They they wave palm branches, they shout Hosanna, they quote from Psalm 118, and they lay their coats on the ground. Let me just briefly go through those. The word Hosanna, it's the Aramaic form of a two-part word that is normally Hoshia, and this emphatic little ending na. Hoshia means liberate us, save us, deliver us. And na is like the sense of urgency, like please. So literally, Hosanna, we think of it as like equivalent to Alleluia, like this praise word, but it actually meant like deliver us, we pray, liberate us, please save us now, right? Psalm 118, they quote, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," but then they add a few words not found anywhere in the psalm. They call him the King of Israel. And they lay their coats on the ground, which probably seems strange to us, but that for them, they knew that was a customary way to coronate a king. It's what they did when Jehu was crowned king in 2 Kings chapter 9, for example. So suddenly we begin to realize they're not just coming to celebrate this religious leader, like they're thinking Jesus is coming as this liberator to save them, as this new king almost. And that's confirmed by the waving of the palm branches. And this is an important story, I think, for your listeners to know of that helps inform so much of what happens throughout the West of Holy Week. So, almost exactly 200 years before, 167 BC, the Seleucid Empire reigned over Jerusalem and that region, and their king ended up desecrating the temple by slaughtering a pig, this unclean animal, on the altar in the temple, sprinkling its blood everywhere, and then he ordered all the towns in Judea to offer sacrifices to the pagan gods. And so in this town of Modine, which I always, now that I live in Texas, I think Modine sounds like a good Texan town, you know. In this little town of Modine, there was a resident who relented, actually one of the priests, and was about to offer a sacrifice to the Seleucid gods when this older priest named Mattathias, it says, became zealous for God. So he lunges forward, stabs the apostate to death, kills the king's inspector, tears down the altar, and then he flees to the hills where many start to gather and join him. Soon after he's dying, and he gathers his five sons around them, and his dying words to them are these: Avenge the wrong done to your people. Pay back these sinners, these Gentiles, in full. Those are his dying words. And his middle son, Judas, takes up that mission and leads a insurrection attempt against the Seleucid Empire. And he's actually surprisingly quite successful in battle. And he's so fierce, actually, that his countrymen give him the nickname Maccabeus, Judas Maccabeus. Maccabeus literally means the hammer. And at one point, he actually regains most of Jerusalem and makes a triumphal entry on a war horse. And the crowds wave, you can guess it, palm branches as he makes his way into the city. And from then on, palm branches became one of the main symbols of the Jewish people's aspirations to gain their independence. And we know this because even at the time of Jesus, even after Jesus, any time the Jewish people thought we got a chance of getting our independence, they started to mint their own coins. And back with Judas Maccabeus, when they started to mint their own coins, they put the palm branch and added the battle cry for the redemption, for the liberation of Zion. And during the first and second Jewish-Roman wars after Jesus, they did the same thing. That palm branch became the symbol of their quest for independence. So when the crowds, in other words, wave palm branches as Jesus is making his way into Jerusalem, it's not like those giant foam hands you see at sporting events. Like it doesn't mean like you're awesome, Jesus, I'm your number one fan, right? It actually is more like a separatist movement's flag would function. Would waving them signify their desire to break free from Roman occupation, and waving them at Jesus signified that they thought he would be the one to lead the liberation. But like you said, he chose to ride a donkey, and John tells us explicitly why he did that. So we don't even have to guess. It was to fulfill Zechariah's vision of a coming peaceable king, Zechariah verses 9, chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. And the amazing thing in that prophecy, this vision, is that this peaceable king is going to come and remove the weapons of war from his own people. Like that'll get you killed. And it did. And he's going to speak peace to all nations, it says. Jesus also chose to enter on the first day of Holy Week, which was known as Lamb Selection Day. It was the 10th month of the Jewish month of Nisan, the 10th day, sorry, of the Jewish month of Nisan. And that was the day when everyone would choose their lamb, hold on to it for 4 days to then slaughter it. And Jesus's route, uh, Mount of Olives, across the Kidron Valley, would have lined up with the route that the sheep were supplied from Bethlehem. Sounds familiar, right? Jesus born in Bethlehem. And both groups would have almost certainly entered through the same gate, the sheep gate, it was called. And so it's this subtle yet unambiguous way that Jesus is saying, I'm not coming like Judas Maccabeus, like the hammer of God, right? I'm coming as the Lamb of God. And of course, it takes all week to begin to understand what that means.
Just comically, I'm like, wow, Jesus is probably one of the best directors of all time. I mean, he really knew what he was doing of
Yeah.
saying, hey, I'm going to use this, which you think is this. It represents this, and I'm going to turn it into this and represent this side of it. And it's just something that, especially people at that time weren't thinking about necessarily, and we still tend to overlook that.
Yeah. Brilliantly said. Yeah, I think it's one the triumphal entry and so many other of Jesus's actions are just uh street theater par excellence, you know. It's just brilliant prophetic action.
And like you mentioned, we see that in Zechariah 9.
Hmm.
And so I actually wanted to read this passage. I know you mentioned a couple things from it, but yeah, just to kind of put this in context. So Zechariah 9, verse 9 and 10, the NIV says, Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow which will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. This makes me think a lot about of what we hear nowadays. So we hear a lot about how we need to fight for our rights, quote unquote,
Mm,
seeking peace and safety for us and our people, but not so much for those who are different from us,
mm,
those in or from other nations. So what do you think this has to say about our current cultural movement of, hey, I'm okay with protecting us, but if it comes to bringing peace to other people who are different than me or in a different situation than me, that seems more frightening. And uh, like I need to protect myself. Why do you think that we find ourselves there?
mm. Well, I'll give a few thoughts. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts too. Like we were talking about beforehand, all of us now live in the United States, and so we're immersed in this very divided, polarized society. Separate from the content of Fight Like Jesus, I'll just say first, I think it, it can sometimes be effective for leaders to make direct appeals to hate others who are not like us, whether they're from a different country or behave differently than we do. Can sometimes be effective, but the far more effective approach is to convince their followers that it's the other side that hates them. And then you can sit back and watch as the human tendency to respond in kind takes care of the rest. And I think we see that a lot in American society today. This convincing one's group that it's the others who have evil intentions, that hate us, that are trying to destroy our way of life. And I think that tactic is quite effective, whether you're Democrat, Republican, left, right, conservative, progressive. Uh, it works equally well on all sides. The only group that I found that it doesn't work well on is that small ragamuffin group of people who have made a resolute commitment to love their enemies, to respond to hate with love and evil with good. Among them, it backfires. But to the content of the book, let me fast forward to Friday after I said the gospel writers don't do that. Let me go ahead and go against that very same thing. At one point, all four gospels, thus indicating how important this scene is, present Pontius Pilate giving a choice to the crowds. Who should I release to you, Jesus or Barabbas, as we say in the States, right? Almost the Southern drawl, Barabbas. To understand the significance of this choice, you have to be able to answer two questions. What was Barabbas's crime, and what's the significance of his name? So, as to the crime, Barabbas was not in jail for a petty misdemeanor, for stealing, etc. The Gospels explicitly tell us that he was in jail because of a failed insurrection attempt, for having killed someone in a failed insurrection attempt. So, in other words, Barabbas had proven his willingness to fight on behalf of his countrymen for their liberation, for their independence. Yes, it was a failed attempt, but at least he was willing to fight. Now, the name, let me pronounce it a little differently. Bar Abba, it literally means son of the Father. And Matthew actually gives us his first name, Jesus Barabbas. Jesus, son of the Father. The gospel writers present this choice as the choice of choosing between two competing messiahs, two competing approaches to making and maintaining peace. Do you want the one who has proven his willingness to fight on behalf of your fellow countrymen? Or will you choose the one who is willing to be slain, but never to slay? And so when you ask that question, it just makes me think of that choice. We all, I think, have to make that choice. And I think the sad reality is many Christians think they're clinging to Jesus, and they are, but it's the wrong Jesus. It's Jesus Barabbas in his approach to peacemaking.
Wow. I feel like I didn't know that. I guess
Mm,
that side of Barabbas of, um, I mean, I knew like, okay, the people were picking this quote unquote evil man,
mm,
and like every time I read that passage, I was always like, yeah, it's crazy that they did that. Like that
mm,
doesn't
mhm.
make sense to me. They just picked a villain over an innocent man. So I mean, of course, all the subscribers and followers know that I work in social media, but so I do social media marketing, and so what you were talking about of hate, um, hate is gold content on social media. I mean,
Yeah.
that's
Spreads
uh,
like wildfire.
yes, yeah. Unfortunately, I've had in my career now of 8 years of working in social media, I've had a lot of people come to me and say like, "Hey, why did this content work well? Like, can you do an audit on why this content's working well?" And I'll look at it and I'll say, "Well, honestly, it's because it's divisive.
Hmm.
It used divisive language, and it makes people feel emotional quickly.
Yeah.
And if you can do that on social media, you're winning the engagement game there. And outside of social media, it's very similar. If you can make people feel emotional quickly and pit themselves against somebody else, that'll work really, really well for whatever you're trying to do or whatever
Mm.
you're trying to build. So I think I see that standpoint certainly on a day to day. And I think that that makes sense with the Barabbas story there of, yeah, understanding why the people may have, chosen him in that moment and why people today still kind of go after that
Hmm.
emotion.
Yeah. Well said.
Think of I think of the fact that we live in a society that vengeance is celebrated. You watch a movie and you killed John Wick's dog, you're in for it, right? That
Hmm.
you're in trouble. And so it's like, and we think, okay, we need to be like that. We need to stand up. And it's usually you've done something wrong to me. It's not I'm just evil going after you, like you said,
Yeah.
Jason. It's like you're threatening me, so I have to therefore, in response, uh, retaliate. And vengeance is the way we do things. This is America. That's how we do things. And so
Yeah.
like many of us, I've enjoyed the incredible series The Chosen about Jesus and his chosen disciples. I just watched the episode where Jesus cleanses the temple with a whip and overturns the tables. He takes out this whip from his back and he starts to snap it around, scaring the tar out of everyone. And people are running in utter fear, and tables catch on fire. And Jesus even does the Indiana Jones move, whip and wrap it around the leg of a table and pull the leg out, and the table falls. And it's and it's frightening. Uh, it is the Jesus we've been waiting for, the Jesus who will finally, who's had enough of
Hmm.
sin that he's seen. So as you studied this passage, the passage of Jesus cleansing the temple, flipping tables, taking out misconceptions that about this, what actually happened on that Monday of Holy Week. Uh, and I'm watching The Chosen, and I watched that episode of The Chosen after I read this chapter in your book, and I'm just like, whoa, that's not what Jason was talking about.
Well, how can I argue with The Chosen? No, I haven't made it that far. I'm in season two, I think, with my kids. Uh, so,
Spoiler, spoiler alert.
yeah, way to ruin it for me, Bob.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh
Come on,
man,
Bob. We didn't know that was going to happen.
no, and honestly, though, I'm not surprised
Nick,
that that's how they interpreted the event. You know, in my research for what's often called the temple cleansing, which takes place on Monday of Holy Week, I found out that in the classic index of famous artwork, the World Painting Index, there's not a single painting of this temple cleansing scene that doesn't depict Jesus behaving violently, whipping people, right? And there is a long and checkered, very sad history of Christian leaders throughout church history using this passage to justify violence. You know, Augustine or Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, he said something like to the Crusaders, repel the foes of Christ, for our leader himself armed his most holy hands with a whip. And even the great Protestant reformer John Calvin used that passage to that scene, that event, that justify the execution of Michael Servetus. So, basically the logic tends to be, since they assume Jesus hurt people with a whip, his followers are also permitted to use force. And by not identifying the issues that upset Jesus, then whatever issue upsets us, we're allowed to use force. And by classifying the whip as a weapon, then his followers can use any weapon, even ones that are infinitely more lethal and indiscriminate than a whip. That tends to cut logic, right? And so in my book, I looked at the three different stages of that event. Maybe for this podcast, we'll focus primarily on the second, the actual use of the whip, right? But there is a preparation phase. The Sunday's events, that triumphal entry, it ends kind of anticlimactically. Jesus, it says, enters the temple. He looks around. He sees what's going on there, and he goes back to Bethany for the night. In other words, he assessed the situation beforehand. So when he comes back on Monday, his actions are not just rash and impetuous as we often depict them, or think that he just snaps, has this temple tantrum, right, and loses it, goes berserk. But that's not how the Gospels describe it. So in the book, I spend quite a bit of time looking at trying to answer the question: do the Gospel writers depict Jesus whipping people with the whip or not? And John's Gospel is the only one that actually mentions the whip. And so let me make just a few points. Number one, John explicitly says that Jesus constructed the whip after entering into the temple. So it's not something he brought with him in a backpack, like you said The Chosen describes it as. It also names the material that he used. The Greek word is skonion, or it's translated by the NIV as cords, but it's more like a wicker material, like you would see like in wicker baskets. So when I learned that, I did what any good millennial would do. I went to Amazon. I found a 200-foot roll of wicker material, free 2-day shipping. I thought it was a miracle. Bought it. Instantly felt terrible for supporting Jeff Bezos. And then when it came, we put on Indiana Jones and we spent the time trying to construct the most intimidating whips we could think of. We could construct, and in the end, they were pretty pathetic. Like no one would have fled in fear with the whips that I had made. If anything, they would have fallen over laughing. And so it's interesting. The two oldest manuscripts we have of the Gospel of John, which are not only the oldest, but considered two of the most reliable manuscripts, they both include the Greek word hos before the word for whip. And hos means to approximate something. So it's the word used when it talks about Jesus sweating something like drops of blood. That's the word hos there. So in other words, the earliest accounts of this event in John's Gospel say that having entered the temple, Jesus made a whip, something like a whip, a pseudo whip out of wicker material. So that's one factor to consider, right? It also, we have pretty good records of what was normally kept in the temple, and animals weren't usually sold and bought in the temple, but it was so many people coming for Passover, they had an exception then. And so the leading theory is that this wicker material would have been the animal bedding used for the cattle and the sheep. So in other words, Jesus may have already been right by these sacrificial animals. We also know that the tower of Fortress Atonia was right next to the temple. It was made to be able to look down into the temple, because the temple is often the spark that triggered revolt. And so Roman soldiers were stationed there. Pilate brought reinforcements, right? And so if there had been any sign that things were going to get really out of hand, that a revolt might be starting, they would have stepped in. They do it in the book of Acts, actually, with Paul. Or maybe it was Peter. I'm forgetting exactly the story. But they don't step in, right? But the most compelling evidence is the Greek itself, and I don't want to get too bogged down. But the key verse is John 2:15, and it literally says, "And making a whip out of cords, he drove out from the temple all." And then it has this phrase, "To the sheep, kai the cattle." To is usually just a logical connector, like we translate it like so. And kai just means and. He drove out from the temple all, so the sheep and the cattle. Would be kind of the usual way you'd think of it. Now, if John had stopped with the word all, he drove out of the temple all, there are 5 antecedents, it's called, things that it could refer back to from previous verses. It could refer to the money changers and the animal sellers. It could refer to the cattle, the sheep, or the doves. We wouldn't know. Grammatically speaking, it could be any of those 5. but he adds this clarifying phrase, to the sheep, kai the cattle. And there's actually 90 other occurrences of a to noun, kai noun construction that modifies a word like the word all, right? And in all of those instances in the New Testament, the to noun, kai noun phrase tells us what the word it modifies is comprised of. So in this case, what's the all comprised of? The sheep and the cattle. And there's actually 12 or 13, I forget now, other occurrences of a to noun, kai noun phrase modifying the word all, just like it does in our passage. And so that has led numerous scholars to conclude that you have to translate that passage as, and making a whip out of cords, Jesus drove out of the temple all, both the sheep and the cattle. In other words, the whip was used as a herding implement, as we know whips like that were made out of wicker material to herd the animals out of the temple, thus killing two birds with one stone, figuratively speaking, of course, right? The animal sellers would have gone racing after their livelihood there as well. So the evidence does not depict Jesus being violent, but it does depict him being angry, assertive, aggressive. And so in the book, I share a story to try to unpack that, to basically say, yeah, for Jesus to sit idly by and do nothing would actually have been an injustice when the animal sellers and the money changers were exploiting the poor, charging these huge prices, and also making it very inconvenient for foreigners to be able to participate. They were set up in the court of the Gentiles. So this exploitative and marginalizing practices. Admittedly, it's a symbolic act, which I think shows us peacemakers. It's okay sometimes if our actions don't bring about complete change. Like the next day, they were almost certainly back selling animals, right? And converting coins to the type that was required to be used in the temple. But it revealed that when religion makes God appear evil, when religion seeks to marginalize the poor and exploit the poor, that it makes it appear as if God wills such things. And so Jesus, like it says in the passage, was zealous for his father's house. But it wasn't the sort of zeal that destroyed others. In fact, it says that the blind and the lame came in and were healed. We often forget that at the end of the scene. And even children who are normally excluded from the temple were singing songs of praise to him.
Wow.
I think just for me, somebody who does not have a theology degree, who reads scripture, um, when I read that passage, I feel like I feel two things when I see that passage. I feel one, where where do I do this
Mm,
in society, or like where do I maybe need to be doing this, standing up and calling out people who are using God's name for the wrong things and doing things in Jesus's name that Jesus would actually have no part of. Um, how am I playing a role in that? And then two, how maybe am I, or how are other people abusing their anger and calling it righteous anger?
yeah,
Because I also grew up in churches and conversations where, something was said and it's like, well, even Jesus was angry, and it's um and we can't use that as an excuse when maybe we chewed somebody out and said, well, that was just righteous anger, holy anger.
yeah,
We can't slap a label on it. Jesus was truly, I like the word you use, assertive there, of saying, this is not me. This is not of my kingdom. This is not what I'm building here on earth. Like, this is not uh, the way that I'm showing you. So when I read that, I think of those two things of, how do we need to do more of this, quote unquote, flipping tables, or at
hmm,
least just addressing things. But then how do we also make sure that we're not doing that?
yeah. We had a guy in the downtown east side in Vancouver who would join us often. We would cook 6 nights a week. Our homeless neighbors would join us for food, and we'd often just hang out. Eclectic worship songs and like singing Amazing Grace and then AC/DC. But we'd sometimes have Bible studies too. And this one gentleman, he would often show up with a really big Bible of his, and he would use that phrase. I was full of righteous zeal, he'd always say. And he'd say how he went to this or that church this week and the pastor was such a heretic. So he stood up in the middle of the service full of righteous zeal and he chewed him out, and I remember just one day, and then he'd always say, at the end of the night, can you walk me home? I'm a little scared to walk in the dark. So I'd walk him home, to his little SRO room. And one night I just felt like, I needed to tell him, maybe focus on righteous love for a while, because it is so easy to confuse a very unrighteous zeal and think it's righteous, right? So Mattathias, it says he was full of zeal for God. He stabs that apostate to death, and the king's inspector, that story I told before, his son Judas, full of zeal for God, it says, so he picks up the sword of the revolutionary. The temple leaders, full of zeal for God, try to, after this event, the temple cleansing, say that they're now looking for a way to kill Jesus. But Jesus, his righteous zeal, it says, will consume him. In other words, it's the Greek word can be translated destroy him. And so, in other words, he's not destroying others with this zeal, but it may lead to his own destruction. But his zeal actually, we forget that part of the story, the part I mentioned at the end, like it actually led to the healing of those who had been ostracized and pushed aside by society and who were not allowed to be in the temple. Suddenly they're welcomed in.
There's another passage in scripture that I think people can use of like, see, Jesus was like this. And so
Mm.
I kind of wanted to bring that up.
Okay.
So the title of your book is Fight Like Jesus. And your thesis is that since Jesus did not fight with any manner of violence, but only with love, he is calling us, his followers, to do the same. So here's a passage that, yeah, I think some people can point to and say, look, there, Jesus is not always nonviolent in his fight. So specifically in Luke 22, Jesus tells his disciples to get some swords. So Luke 22:35 to 38. Again, NIV, it says, then Jesus asked them, when I sent you without purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? Nothing, they answered. He said to them, but now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. It is written, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. And then verse 38, the disciple said, see, Lord, here are two swords. That's enough, he replied. So it, I think some people reading this can say Jesus at least is advocating for self-defense in this passage, or Jesus approves our right to defend ourselves and those us with deadly force if needed. And that's what a lot of people are getting out of this passage, right?
Yeah. In writing Fight Like Jesus, I was not trying to write an apology in the sense of trying to address the questions of those who don't hold to a Christians who don't hold to a nonviolence view. But it's interesting that some of the key passages that people who don't hold to a nonviolence view go to take place during Holy Week. So the temple cleansing and then this passage, right, are two of the main ones. And so I spent a good bit of time looking at it in the Thursday chapter. So I'll make a few comments here. First of all, if Jesus intended for these swords to be used for self-defense, it's hard to explain how two swords would be enough to defend at least 12 men from attack, right? And second, when one of the disciples actually uses the sword in defense, Jesus rebukes him. So that interpretation is a little problematic, right? So let's think about what it says there in Luke 22. He says, basically acquire swords. They say we have two. He says that's enough. Now, some Christian pacifists throughout the centuries have tried to say, well, these weren't really swords at all. And admittedly, in the Greek, it refers more to like a short dagger. And I've even seen interpretations where they're like, it was actually cooking instruments. It must have been two of the carving knives for the Paschal lamb at that supper. But that falls apart when we realize that the same word is used to describe the swords that the mob shows up with when they come to arrest Jesus in the garden. So that doesn't work. That doesn't explain it. Others have tried, starting 2 centuries ago, a Scottish theologian tried to reinterpret Jesus's answer, that's enough. When they say, look, Lord, we have two swords here. We don't even need to go buy them. We just have two swords, right? That's enough. He retranslated it as enough of this. Like Jesus is disgusted as if they've missed the point. They misunderstood him once again. But I'm wary of that interpretation as well. Why would it take 19 centuries for a Christian to come up with that interpretation if it was the right one? Uh, but also, it's hard to interpret the Greek that way. But actually, the passage explicitly has Jesus saying why he wants them to have two swords. And you quoted from the NIV, and the NIV actually doesn't translate the Greek word gar, which just means like because or for. So let me flip in the book to where I quote that part. Um, he says, "But now, if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. For or because it is written, and he was numbered among the transgressors." That's how the NIV translates it. Transgressors, it's the Greek word anamos. The A at the start is kind of like political versus apolitical, right? It means like outside of, and namas, the law. So outside of the law. So you'll see some translations that say, get these swords because it is written, he was numbered among the outlaws, the lawless, or the New Living Translation, he was numbered among the rebels. And so suddenly it starts to at least make some sense. Two swords are enough to convince a group that Jesus might have been leading an armed rebellion. But of course, that just adds new questions, right? Like, why would Jesus care about fulfilling this kind of cryptic prophecy? Why would he want to be numbered among the rebels? And the answer seems to come just hours later in the Garden of Gethsemane when the mob does come armed with clubs and the same type of sword, right, to arrest Jesus, thinking that they're they're going to put up a fight, Jesus and his followers. But let's think about that scene. Before researching this book, I thought that this is when Jesus' disciples flee. When the mob, this armed, angry mob shows up, man, the rest of those disciples, they book it out of there. That's not what the passage says. It says rather like good Americans who didn't go looking for a fight, but they weren't going to back down from one. They stand their ground. They even asked Jesus, Lord, should we fight? Should we use our swords? But the answer seems so obvious. They don't even wait for Jesus to answer. Peter pulls out his sword, chops off the ear of Caiaphas's servant, right? And now we finally see why. Jesus says, enough of this. And it kind of reveals actually that words can be more powerful than swords because everyone stops fighting. And then Jesus heals that servant's ear, thus undoing the damage of Peter's violence. And then he issues a new universal statement. And some have tried to say Jesus condemns Peter's violence because he had to die. The redemption of God's people had to take place. This was an exception. But I forget the name of the person I quote in the book, but someone pointed out that when Jesus said to Peter, put your sword away, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword, that it was not a the time is not right kind of prohibition. It was a the time is never right kind of prohibition. So why did Jesus let his disciples acquire two swords? To fulfill this prophecy that he would be numbered among the lawless, the outlaws, the rebels. It seems to me, based on the context of the passage, it was so that Jesus could once and for all unequivocally declare that violence was forbidden for his followers, and to do so while he could still undo the damaging effects of that violence. And the early church picked up on this, like Tertullian and others would say, Christ, in disarming Peter, disarmed every soldier. And other early Christian writers picked up on the fact that this took place in a garden, seeing it as a fulfillment of Isaiah, Joel, and Micah's prophecy about weapons of war being converted into garden tools, these tools of destruction being converted into tools that cultivate life.
The entire book is talking about each and every day of Holy Week, and that in each one of these days, there's something, sometimes many things, the things that make for peace, that Jesus is displaying for us, the reason he is doing what he's doing. In the way, we walk in the way of Christ. And so this is the way you're to walk now. And I love that. I mean, why did he do the sword thing? It's like, I got to teach my disciples something about swords and about violence and how this is a problem, right? And so it's
Yeah.
it's another street drama.
Hmm.
Again, it's like, this is drama. Let me show you. If I told you, it would be one thing. Look at this. You cut a guy's ear off, right? And so it's each and every day is something about how do we live the life of Jesus. And so, for the sake of time, I just want to go straight to Easter Sunday.
Okay.
And he is talking to his disciples, and he's okay. Now I'm going to send you as I have been sent. Now I send you. And he uses some interesting words there that indicate how he is sending us, his disciples, into the world and what we're called to do. So, can you unpack this passage? It's in John chapter 20, verses 19 through 22. On the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side, and the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." So I know that in the Jewish custom, when you meet somebody, you greet somebody for the first time, you say shalom, which basically means peace be with you, right?
Hmm.
And so it makes sense that when he shows up and they're scared, he's like, "Peace be with shalom. Here I am." And so that makes sense to me. But then he says it again. I mean, he doesn't have to be, he's not greeting them again. So it's something going on about this peace, this shalom, as he's now commissioning his disciples into the world. What is that?
Yeah, great question. So to back up just a little bit, Thursday ends, like I said, the disciples stand their ground in the garden when the mob shows up, but it's when Jesus rebukes them and says they're not allowed to use violence. That's when they flee.
Oh,
Uh, and in fact, it says one of them flees naked. He leaves his garments. He's in such a hurry to get out of there, which seems strange until you realize the Gospels say that the disciples left everything to follow Jesus, and now one of them is leaving everything literally to get away from Jesus. On Friday, I think to understand what happens on Sunday, I got to just briefly talk about Friday. Jesus is
Friday's
dying.
not important. It's just the cross. Come on now.
So,
You're rebuking me for skipping Good Friday, and it's good. It's good that you
no.
are.
Well, let me just make one point. You remember when I told the story of Mattathias, that old priest that inspired his son to lead that successful revolt? His dying words, "Avenge the wrong done to your people, pay back the Gentiles in full." Those words, those dying words sparked a revolution, a violent one. Well, Jesus's dying words, the first words, his instinctive thing to say is when we nail him to a cross, are quite different. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I mean, they could not be more different than Mattathias's dying words. And I think Jesus's dying words also sparked a revolution, although albeit a non-violent one, right? And so when Jesus appears to his disciples on Sunday into the locked room, and like you said, he says, "Peace be with you," and then goes on to say it again, "Peace be with you," and in between those two statements, has them examine the wounds on his side. It's almost as if I feel like Jesus is saying, "Look, here's how I make peace. It's not the taking of life; it's the being willing to sacrificially lay down my own life." And then he gives them this commission, like you said, "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." Or like on Monday, Thursday, "Love one another as I have loved you." Jesus is the new standard of love. Jesus is the one on whose life we seek to model, and the way as Jesus was sent. In other words, we are sent. But then it says, and maybe I'll just read from the book here. Thankfully, we are not expected to carry out this mission, right? "As the Father sent me, so I send you." We're not expected to carry out this mission on our own. Rather, as soon as Jesus commissioned his disciples, he then breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." And then, in the final words of Easter Sunday, Jesus revealed the primary power that the Holy Spirit bestows upon us. It is not, as many throughout history have assumed, the power to be victorious in battle or the strength to exact revenge on one's enemies. Quite the opposite. According to Jesus, as we go out into the world as his ambassadors for peace, the Holy Spirit will empower us to extend God's forgiveness to others. Put simply, forgiveness is our superpower.
Thanks for tying together the last words of the father of Maccabeus and the
Hmm.
last word of Jesus. I mean, they cannot be any more different. The hammer, Jesus isn't interested in being a hammer.
We're meant to see it as the Lamb of God versus the hammer of
Yes.
God, I think. Yeah.
Yes. Right. Right. Well, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate this book. It is a deep read. This is the shelf of books of guests that we've had on the podcast, and it's going to go up there. But I have lots of shelves of books, and I have two huge shelves of biblical commentaries. And if I were to shelve this, it would be shelved within the gospel to commentaries because
Mm,
this is the best commentary I've read on Holy Week. And so I cannot recommend this book more for the pastors who are listening, the campus ministers that are listening, and any lay person who's listening. We're going to uh, air this episode, Jason, before Easter week, so that people can hear this story and can maybe engage
yeah.
Holy Week in a different way.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, gentlemen, so much. It's been a delight to get to chat with you about this content.
Yeah, thanks
Thanks.
so much. We really appreciate all your insight. It was very helpful for our understanding. So thank you.
Yep.
I mean, it's a it's 180 pages, but it's like, how did you do that? Right. So
Multiple
such
years.
such dense material, but what's
Mhm.
interesting is that I mean I really do think it's a great book because it isn't dry commentary. It is great prose.
Oh,
It
thanks.
is it tells stories and it explains things in ways that anybody can understand. So I
Yeah.
think it's really excellent.
When one of my first spiritual directors was a pretty successful Christian author, did a lot of ghostwriting for some big books. Um, and when I came to him once and mentioned that I just felt really burdened to write on this content, and he listened for a while, and then he said, "Well, Jason, I think you're at least 10 years away from writing this book." I was like, 10 years, He's like, I think you got to live it and study the craft of writing. And I think both were really true. So it actually took 13 years to write, to,
Oh my goodness.
about the last 4 years focused on writing it, but 13 years to live it, research it, try to apply it in Indonesia, Vancouver, in my own life and life. Yeah. But yeah, I think a lot of people neglect that part about studying the craft of writing. Like I was a math major for most of college. I didn't think I'd be a writer. So
That's
yeah,
crazy. Wow, that's
yeah.
awesome.
So well, anyways,
That's very
gentlemen,
cool.
great to get to meet you both. Bob, I read a little bit of your bio earlier this morning. I went to the Reintegrate website, and yeah, sounds like you're still doing campus ministry stuff, right?
I am.
That's awesome. And David, you
David
said you
David
do social media marketing.
Yeah, yeah. So
Awesome.
I was also a part of the CCO that
Uh-huh.
Bob's does his campus ministry through. So I did a fellowship year there, actually with Bob, and then I ended up leaving after that fellowship year to pursue. I got a degree in communications, and
Yep.
so I got a job in social media marketing that I've been doing. But thankfully, have been able to stay connected with Bob through the podcast and everything. So
Nice.
yeah,
Nice.
yeah.
Well, thanks for the
So it's
invitation, and I'm
yeah,
glad
we
it
really
worked
appreciate
out.
it.
So,
Yeah, we enjoyed having you.
thanks.
thanks.
Yep.
Yeah.
Take care,
See
gentlemen.
ya. Yep,
Bye.
you
You
too.
too.
I'm glad he brought up the importance of the Friday before Sunday. I was always so upset about that growing up. I felt like what I was seeing a lot in Christian culture was like, yeah, Friday is bleh. but Sunday's coming. But like it's always but Sunday's coming. And I think I can appreciate that, but one thing I wanted to tell him was like I think Friday for me, I think we do tend to fast forward through that because we don't want to feel that emotion and we don't want to own up to anything and we don't want to lament and we don't want to think about our savior, our king. We want to think about him reigning over everybody and not him at his weakest point. And I remember specifically one year we had a Good Friday service at the church I was going to, and again, nothing wrong with this church at all. This is actually a really great church I went to, but I remember leaving that Good Friday service, and I was like, I feel like at least myself, I can't maybe speak for other people, but I feel like we kind of missed the point a little bit because we kept ending everything and every song we sang, we kept ending everything with, but Sunday's coming. And it's like, yes, praise God. Hallelujah, Sunday's coming. But and maybe it's my personality too. I'm like, I want to sit in this though. I like really want to feel what Jesus was feeling. I mean, to the point of tears and sweating in the garden and like that's heavy. I don't think we
Yeah,
can just skip over that. That's
right.
a big part of the story. And that like I feel like as Christians we don't like to sit with, but I feel like we need to, especially more and more in today's world. Like let's sit with the heaviness of that.
He makes a fascinating observation about the cross, the moment on the cross and how hard that is. He writes, a theologian notes this, all four gospels take pains to not focus on the physical sufferings of Jesus upon the cross. Mark, for example, simply writes, and they crucified him, 4 words. Matthew, Luke, and John are equally brief in their descriptions. One verse in Matthew, one verse in Luke, one verse in John. And the gospel writers, what they do focus on, however, is how Jesus responded once he was nailed to the cross. And so the words of Jesus on the cross, the words are more powerful than the actual suffering. And so, you know,
Mhm.
a lot of people when Easter comes around and they want to get into that mindset of what you're talking about. I need to sit in this. And so what they do is they 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 stream The Passion by
Mhm.
Mel Gibson, right? And they
Yeah.
want to see the suffering of Jesus. And they want to feel how awful it was. Now it is awful, but the
Mhm.
Gospels actually never really focus on that. He did get
Right.
flogged. It doesn't, it talks about that. He did put a crown of thorns on his, but passion is the entire week. And what Jason is talking about is this passion for love, this
Yeah.
passion for uh, uh, transforming the world in a new, completely revolutionary way. And when you hear revolutionary, it's like, oh, good, violence. He's like, no, the actual revolution about this is that it's not violent, that it's completely countercultural.
Yeah, think of what we want in leadership today. Sometimes, yeah, we think about that. Yeah, I want someone to fight back and stand up and um you know, but I think Jesus obviously shows a different side of leadership. Um, because he knew he couldn't just fight back and just say like, I don't want to go to the cross actually. JK. Uh for, forget saving the world and for saving all of this. Um but instead he went in humility and I think that's a really good point is yes, people do want to get caught up in the graphicness of that to feel it, but I think ultimately I think you're right. I think what we should be focusing on is that words have prove to have more power and weight, and Jesus proved that. of forgiving the people that were literally murdering him in the moment, um, and not fighting back, choosing not to fight back, rebuking people who were fighting back. Um, I think that that shows a completely, like you said, countercultural experience to what we see in today's leadership on any scale.
So in our cultural moment, I just, when I was reading this, I just kept on thinking about how are we as Christians in America, how are we going to uh, properly, as Jesus would, seek to transform our culture? Seek
Mm.
to make it a better place for everybody to live, make it more like Jesus would want it to be, right?
Yeah,
There's, I mean, the majority opinion is we've got to take this thing by force. We,
right.
we've got to, we've been pansies for too long, right?
Hmm.
It's time to just say enough is enough, grab our whips and start flipping some tables.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I actually got in a conversation with somebody who, and he was telling me that's exactly the passage that he went to to justify his anger and his desire to see people hurt because of what they're doing that aren't the non-Christians that are trying to destroy our culture.
yeah, yeah. And it's scary, to think about people that want to weaponize that for their own gain. I think that that's terrifying because that's not the context of it, and that's not if you read the rest of the Bible, it's not how Jesus is responding. Um, yeah, that is terrifying, and I feel like, for me personally, that I was always told, growing up like that was righteous anger, and it's okay to be angry, but it comes with responsibility. The Spider-Man quote, with great power comes responsibility. Um, but I
That's
think,
that's in the Greek somewhere in John, I think.
yeah, yeah, somewhere like
Sam Raimi
it's
was a biblical scholar.
it's like the Bible expanded edition or something. But is that too sacrilegious? I don't know. But but yeah, I always think that's so true. And I do feel like we are getting that right now in our society. We're getting this movement of, and I'll just use these terms loosely, but like right now, I feel like the right side, or Republicans, conservatives, feel like the left side, the Democrats, the progressives, have been pushing for so long that now this side needs to, it's our time. We have our guy in leadership right now where we feel like we can push back using force. And we can do this as Christians, and it's okay. Because we need to do this for the gospel. And I've been heartbroken to see that, because I just don't think that I think Jesus would say, "Hey, put down your weapons. Put down your weapons, please. Like, please, we can do this differently." Um, and so I feel like I would say, for me, again, me personally, I'm gonna say something woke here. So if anybody gets offended by my wokeness, I'm sorry. Um, One of the things I feel like I had to learn as I've gotten older, and with our political climate and society, is I've had to realize that I have privilege in our society, that I get to choose to overlook things because it's not a part of my life. And I feel like that's a big step for everyone to start with. Like, if I had a call to action for our listeners or like followers, like that would be it, is just educating yourself with what's going on around you. Because like as a white man, I get to just choose to just kind of not see things because it's not part of my life. I'm not saying that like because I'm white, my life is perfect. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying no matter who you are in life, you have certain privileges where you literally live in walls of your home. And if you're not educating yourself and if you're not having conversations outside of your comfort zone with people who are different than you, then you tend to just live in your own world and build up this sense of like, well, I'm going to defend me. I'm getting my sword. And
Right.
if we're looking after Jesus, um, I think Jesus would, I believe he would encourage that to say, yeah, let's all look at the privileges we have and then try to understand people that may not have that same privilege where they don't get to just overlook something.
Jesus went out of his way to be with the marginalized.
Hmm.
He would eat with the marginalized. He would care for the poor and downtrodden, the people who were outcasts. And so, he would, who's my neighbor? He gives a story about the Samaritan. It's like, what? A Samaritan? He doesn't care about us, and he's actually caring about one of us. And so he is constantly pushing our boundaries of, you think it's about you, but what about all the people around you? Are you loving them? And so if we're not, like you said, it takes a long time for me as a white man to have empathy for people who are not white men. And
Yeah.
so black and brown people, it's like, okay, well, what I'm seeing, what upsets me so much is that Christians are not being empathetic to those who are not them. And
Right.
so, and so Jesus enters into Jerusalem on a donkey, quoting Zechariah, and Zechariah's prophecy is that the king comes in so that all the nations can be blessed. All the nations, not just us. And he says, all everyone, their weapons are going to be destroyed. There will be no more war. Nobody, the bows and the war horses of everyone will be gone, not just the bad guys, but
Hmm.
us, right? And so it's no longer about me against somebody. Jesus is actually saying, you know what? You're part of the problem. If you don't see yourself as with your violent tendencies and your self-righteous hatred towards those who are not like you, if that is who you are, you're actually part of the problem. You're being Jesus Barabbas, instead of
Hmm.
Jesus of Nazareth. And I think that's such a strong contrast that Jason made for us between those two ways of thinking. We want to we want to change things. We see things are wrong. We think it's so bad for us white Christians in America. How do you think the Jews felt in being occupied by Rome?
Yeah.
1,000 times worse, right? And
Right.
so Jesus comes into that situation and says, nope, it is not a violent revolution that we need. It is a peaceful revolution. The way you change people's lives is through peace and love. It sounds so flowery and hippy dippy.
Hmm.
It's like, oh, that you're going to do go there. We roll our eyes and we're like, oh, there we go again. Here's somebody who's like interpreting Jesus as some kind of hippie.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like we all need a little bit more of that because I love that Jesus came, on a donkey. All of these like dichotomy situations you see, and people are like, "Oh yes, finally, bring down the Romans," and then Jesus is like, "Actually, I'm here to save the Romans, and you like." I'm here to also like heal you and teach you how to be better people. I'm here to actually like teach you um, how to serve and have forgiveness. I also think of that scene in The Chosen where he puts on or like he carries the Roman soldiers' equipment and walks, like miles holding their equipment. And that's like unheard of. And it's like, what are you
Right.
doing? Um,
So
but
that is so subversive. That
right.
right there is what's subversive. Instead of getting PO'd at the Roman soldier saying, carry my stuff a mile, Jesus is like, okay, doing it 3 miles. And
Yeah.
it's like that causes people to go, whoa, wait, what?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And like that is what I think we're missing right now in our society is we're so quick to write out a long Facebook post blaming somebody or blaming a group of people and then going to church and praying for deliverance from that group of people. Like that's our problem right now. It feels like
Mm.
when in actuality Jesus is saying like look at yourself first. Like how are you helping in this situation? Are you making it worse? Are there things you could be doing better? And then like what are you doing about it? Besides, yeah, typing on Facebook, like have you tried carrying their equipment 3 miles, like metaphorically or whatever it is? Like there's a different call to action that Jesus has for us than what we have for ourselves. Instead of like arguing about a group of people and then praying for deliverance from them, Jesus is calling in us into a relationship with that same group of people that we're calling out on social media, that we're having arguments about. Jesus is like, I'm here to deliver all of you together.
And again, it's not, this might sound to our listeners that we're that we're berating one side and not the other.
Right.
It's like I have to check my emotions and check the
Yeah.
way I deal with people because I'm upset about this stuff as it comes across as we're talking. It's like, how do I, and it's like, oh, you people, and so it's like, how do I lovingly,
Hmm.
peaceably get across the point that we want to live a different way, and then to humbly state, I haven't got there yet either. It's like, you know, I
No.
I want to just do something
Yeah.
revolutionary. And
Yeah.
that's when Jesus is like, okay,
Yeah.
the title of N.T. Wright's book is the Day the Revolution Began, and that was the day of the cross.
Yeah.
Oh, what revolution are we talking about now? Whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah. Yeah. And exactly like you said, I have to check myself because I fall into that too. As we're talking about it, or as I'm on social media and I'm scrolling and I'm like, man, like I'm right, they're wrong. How do I get them to see this? Like I don't
Uh,
understand. And then I very quickly in my head, I'm like, hey, don't become the person that you are angry about right now. Like you're literally becoming the person that you're upset with.
my gosh, it's exactly what happens to me.
And you can't do that. You cannot, we're not fighting with fire here. We're not whipping out our swords. We are putting the sword away and we're saying, hey, I think that's important to acknowledge of like, hey, I'm getting worked up about this. So like,
So
let me
here's
take a breath.
the perfect example of that. Uh, uh, Erica Kirk says we must love our enemies and forgive our enemies, right? In
Hmm.
in in her in her talk at Charlie Kirk's funeral
Hmm.
memorial service. The next person up is President Trump, and he says, "Sorry, Erica, I hate my enemies. I don't want anything to do with them."
Yeah.
My response to that is to hate him hating me.
Right. Right.
It's like this just creates the cycle of hate, hate,
Yeah.
hate, 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 hate. And Erica is saying, whoa, 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 whoa. What what short circuits all this is not more hate, it's love. And so she was perfectly a perfect statement about this is the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus is to short circuit all the hate with love.
Yeah.
And this is a woman who just watched her husband get killed, who's able to say
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately it's like I think that's where we're at, and it's upsetting. But I mean, let's be real, like that's just what the devil is wanting, is for us to just toil with each other and cause all of this ruckus. And Jesus is like, just forgive each other. Just just forgive each other and pray for each other and sit there with each other. Like,
I probably wouldn't have got that upset because I know Trump hates his enemies. I mean, that's fine. I mean, that's who
mhm.
he is. That's who he always has been. I mean, that hasn't changed in 80 years of his life, right? That's who he is and who he always will be. But what's interesting is that it was at a Christian memorial service, and the
Yeah.
same Christians that were there singing with Chris Tomlin and then hearing Eric uh, uh, Kirk say
Mm.
that and cheer her when she said that, then turn
Yeah.
around and cheered Trump when he said what he had to say. And I'm just like, what? There's something wrong right now with Christianity in the world that we could cheer both those statements, which again are Jesus of Nazareth versus Jesus Barabbas.
The same people that are like, yes, like forgiveness is good, pray for our enemies. But I hate our enemies. And it's like they live in, and I can find myself here too sometimes if I'm not careful. Like you can live in both worlds of like, yeah, I want to pray for my enemy, but I hate them. Like deep down, I have a rooted anger and hatred towards them. And that was happening in scripture. Like we haven't moved very far, it feels like. And Jesus is saying, like, let's uproot that deep hatred because I came here again to deliver all of you. The person right now who you're thinking about who you hate, I've come to deliver as well as you. So we that's the ministry of Jesus, and it's so different. It's so different.